I want to first of all introduce and thank Professor Preeti Mudliar from the International Institute for Information Technology in Bangalore. So Preeti's research interests centre around infrastructure, gender and design. So three things that came up very powerfully towards the end of the sessions yesterday. And in part, this is speaking to the domain of human-computer interaction, a field that I began in many years ago, but which is now something that is so prevalent and important in each and every kind of moment of life for people around the world, that I think it's a really kind of real benefit to have that longer sense of how we got to the kind of digital environments that we have today. And Preeti is going to be talking about bodies on biometric duties, locating children in a datafied welfare state. So thinking about children particularly, which I think is tremendously valuable to put front and center because they are our intelligent futures, but also thinking about the ways in which Aadhaar and the huge experiments in biometrics are kind of shaping particular kinds of relationships between citizens and future citizens and government. So with no more ado, I will hand over to Preeti. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and thank you to the Australia India Institute for this very nice invitation. And let me just share my screen. Is this visible?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So, try and move this. Right. So I'm going to be talking about bodies on biometric duties, locating children in a datafied welfare state. And this talk is drawing upon several years of field work that I have been doing in Rajasthan, trying to understand how the introduction of Aadhaar is influencing and shaping people's access to food entitlements. I'm just trying to move the screen. So my work is to do with food security and the means with which food security is achieved. And this comes with a certain moral component to it, a very strong moral component to it, because the recognition of the right to food is something that is deemed moral by all societies globally. And Amartya Sen writes that both freedom from hunger and the institutional structures to achieve it are invested with the weight of moral values and moral assessment, which makes it very important to understand that in the pursuit of food security, what are the means that welfare organizations, that states globally are employing. And in contemporary times, it's really biometric infrastructures that have wide currency, both with aid organizations such as the United Nations, as well as there is a lot of buy-in for the deployment of biometrics amongst many countries around the world. And in India, given its scale, given its population, everything just organically magnifies and scales. And the Aadhaar database, which is the largest of its kind in the world that contains citizen biometrics, was introduced as a measure of inclusion, especially targeting welfare schemes, because it was thought that it's very difficult for people to get any form of state identification. And therefore, if you collect bodily markers, it's just going to make it that much easier for the state not only to recognize citizens, but also for citizens to be able to lay claim to their rights. So food security in India is currently covered under the National Food Security Act, which was passed in 2013. This covers 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population. So food security in India is not universal. If you are a rural citizen, then if the ceiling of 75% has been achieved, then there is a wait to get into the food security list. And similarly, for the urban population, the ceiling is at 50%. Now, when NFSA was introduced in the Parliament of India, the proposal was that they would reform the public distribution system, which is what the food security system is called in India, by leveraging the biometrics of beneficiaries so that they could widen the inclusion net and also reduce corruption, because the PDS in India is quite vulnerable to leakages of and diversion of food grains onto the black market. And therefore, several states in India had been looking for ways to curb this, and biometrics was thought to be a viable measure towards this goal. And once Aadhaar started gaining steam and a sizable population was enrolled in the database, because suddenly you couldn't really do business in India for even things as simple as getting a mobile phone if you didn't really have an Aadhaar card. And coercion of this kind meant that a lot of people were very quickly being onboarded for various things. Of course, the matter went to court. Several applications were filed. And in 2018, the Supreme Court then ruled that if you are accessing any welfare benefit sponsored by the state, including the PDS, then Aadhaar would be a mandatory measure for the same. So it is in this backdrop that my field work began. So this is my field setting. My work is in Ajmer district in Rajasthan. And just to give you a sense of the kind of communities where I work, all of these are rural agricultural communities. And they lay 5 to 45 kilometers on both sides of NH48, which is also the highway connecting Jaipur to Ajmer. And this is important to mention because there's varying internet connectivity in these parts depending on your proximity to the highway. And the Aadhaar-based PDS program began in these parts in January 2016, and my data collection began in March 2017, going up to May 2019. The pandemic hit, and I returned to the field early this month. So I'm still making the transition from my field to the urban city of Bangalore, where I'm based. So just to give you a sense of where this data is coming from. So I do a lot of observations and interviews at the PDS shops where food grains are actually distributed. So most of this data is coming from 14 dealers based across 10 villages. And I've observed the authentication processes of 136 beneficiaries. And this involves just looking at the number of authentication trials performed by beneficiaries, because it's very rare that anybody is able to pass their biometric authentication right at the first trial. It typically takes at least 2, if not more. And observing interactions, the verbal, non-verbal actions and reactions during the authentication process. What are the dealers saying? What are the bystanders saying? Because this often takes on a very theatrical component, especially because the machine, the POS machine, the point of sale machine on which these the biometric authentication is performed also has voice prompts baked into it. So it will call out every step as you're performing. It will say, okay, you've now please place your finger on the scanner and your Aadhaar is incorrect or your Aadhaar is correct. And it will call all of this out in Hindi. So therefore, it takes on a very performative dimension with people, straining to see what is happening to the person in front of them, because it can be quite an anxious process for everybody who's waiting in the queue. Then I would also visit beneficiaries' homes and work site and do interviews and observations even there. This was also important because anecdotally, when I would visit, especially in the month of March, which is also the harvest season, both beneficiaries and PDS dealers would tell me that the number of failed authentications tend to increase during the harvest period, because the crop that is grown in these parts is that of the chickpea, or chana as we would call it in Hindi. And the way it is harvested is that the laborers just yank the crop off with their bare hands, and it is quite a thorny crop, which means that their fingers and their palms usually have very deep cuts which makes it even more challenging for them to pass authentication. To give you a sense of my sample, I've interviewed 69 women, 67 men, and 42 children, and also government school teachers. And I'll come to why the school teachers assumed importance. They weren't necessarily a segment that I was looking at, but given that this is ethnographic work, there were certain insights that emerged from data which made me also turn to school teachers for their point of view on what's really happening. A lot of my data also comes from interviewing and observing state agencies, both district authorities at Ajmer, state authorities in Jaipur. And I also filed a right to information application seeking more information from the state on the beneficiary data that they have. So this is how the biometric authentication process looks like. So the dealer will connect the point of sale terminal to mobile internet data, as you can see in the picture. The dealer enters the ration card number into the machine, which displays the list of members attached to the card. The dealer will select the name of the beneficiary who will perform the authentication. The beneficiary then places a finger on the biometric sensor of the machine for authentication. If a match is found, the beneficiary collects the food grain entitlement for the family and leaves. So it's a pretty straightforward process when you look at it, but in the way that it actually is executed, it can be quite messy. And this is primarily because of very weak internet infrastructure. And in the early days when the biometric system was first introduced, state authorities would often tell me that, you need to be patient because this is a newly introduced infrastructure and it takes time for things to settle down. But even as late as October this month, when I was in Rajasthan, I didn't really find internet problems being resolved. As you can see, people climb trees, people are climbing buildings just to place the antenna to amplify the mobile internet signal. And the other reason or the other challenge to this entire process is simply that people's bodies fail. Their fingers are just unable to pass authentication for various reasons. It could be because of hard manual labor. It could simply be because they have applied mehendi to their hands. It could be because they're just old and the clarity of your fingerprints begins to decrease as you age. So out of the 136 authentication processes that I observed, I found that 41% succeeded in authenticating the fingerprints on the first attempt, 22% could authenticate on second and third attempts, and 36% experienced repeated authentication failures above 4 attempts, which means that they could simply not access their share of food grains because in the early days when the authentication process was introduced, it was just not possible. There was no alternative. So either your finger passed authentication or it did not. And if it did not, you did not get access to your food entitlement. And therefore, you had a lot of people just engaged in repairing fingers. And I found that water is a very important component. So all the PDS dealers had to make arrangements for water because people needed to wash their hands and they would do all sorts of things. The recommended step for them was to just sit on the ground, scrub their fingers in the earth, use the mud and clean their fingers and wash, right? So the PDS dealers would tell me, well, we have to arrange for water. We cannot really begin the food distribution process without ensuring that a source of water is present. Or then they would also use oil or sweat from their scalps to groom the fingers so that it just becomes easier to authenticate. And all of this just meant that, there were just long wait times. These are poor people and many of them are daily wage earners and they would often lose out on their day's earnings because they would just come here to receive their food entitlements, but there would be long wait times or the internet signal would not be working or their fingers would not pass authentication even after repeated attempts. So therefore, it was quite challenging on various fronts. So for instance, one challenge that participants faced was simply to the dignity of their self. And like this beneficiary said, I'm 72 years old and I'm the only person who can come from my family because everybody else is engaged in work. But when I come, my fingers are repeatedly failing, and then I have to squat here in public with everyone looking at me, trying to wash my fingers, scrub them in the mud, and just get them to work. And it just makes me very sad having to do this. There were also several privacy concerns, and the woman would say that we are grateful that our face is veiled, and nobody can see that my cheeks are burning up in shame, that I have to sit and scrub my fingers in the mud. And I just feel a sense of shame at having to do this, and it is intruding on my privacy in various ways. And this was very interestingly contradicting or in conflict with the kind of debates around privacy that Aadhaar had seen, because the even when cases were filed in the Supreme Court, the argument was that the data that is being collected by the state in the form of biometrics is infringing on the privacy of citizens. But these beneficiaries of the PDS were not really concerned about how the data is going to be used. They were more concerned about the privacy of the body and what is really happening to the physical and their emotional sense of self, rather than what is happening to the biometric data. So the value conflicts experienced by the beneficiaries were really about time, dignity, and privacy. And this is where I begin to notice that a lot of children are coming in to perform biometric authentication in the PDS. And this is also mainly because children, because they are younger, their fingers are less prone to failures. And they are also more obedient, and they are okay when the parents say, okay, do not go to school today, you have to perform this important task, because otherwise how do we eat? And they would get pulled out from school, and or they would have to forego their playtime. So when I began following up on this, I realized that it's something that's happening pretty significantly. And when you turn to the children to find out what their experience of performing the biometric authentication act is, that the children said, well, I experience a lot of anxiety because my parent just drops me here and they go off. And, all of these adults are there. And in front of them, even when my fingerprints fail, I experience a lot of anxiety. And then they also said that, well, this is a process governed by adults. There are, grown people all around. Even if I am standing in the queue, people behind me will often try and jump. They'll try and keep pushing me behind because I'm younger. I'm not really able to push back against the kind of things adults tell me to do. We also get scolded a lot because we are impatient, of course, and we don't know that, we have to wait for a long time. And then turning to the school teachers to understand what kind of an impact this was having on the schooling of children, I found all the school teachers I spoke to say that, it definitely is affecting attendance. And they also pointed out that it is not that children do not miss school for other reasons, especially because we are a rural community, we are a rural agricultural community. Children often miss school, sometimes they have caregiving responsibilities, sometimes they have to take the cattle out for grazing. However, with the PDS biometric system, their absence is assured every month. So if caregiving responsibilities may make them miss school, say once in 3 months or once in 2 months, having to perform the biometric authentication means that, every month, depending on whether how early or how delayed it takes to get their food entitlements, they can very easily miss school for 1 to 3 days per month. So every class had 4 to 5 students who regularly miss school for PDS biometrics. And the school said that we can't even penalize them because we understand that the food grain is very important for their survival. And therefore, we just have no option but to let it continue. So based on these observations, I filed a right to information application. And the questions that were part of this application were also emerging from my field work. It was quite a challenging process. Typically, an RTI should be responded in 30 days. That is the mandated time. However, my applications would keep disappearing and I had to do several follow-ups. So I received the data only in February 2020, although I filed it in June 2019. And by then, the pandemic also hit. So a lot of my field work was disrupted because of that. So these are the details that I sought for every beneficiary under the age of 18 who had performed biometric authentication for PDS in Rajasthan. I sought age because I wanted to know what kind of age groups are performing authentication, gender, just to see whether the boys are more than girls. I wanted to understand if authentication was performed on a weekend or a weekday, because the school in my site especially runs from Mondays to Saturdays, and PDS is not distributed on Sundays. So I just wanted to know what that looked like. The month, district, and block details of where the authentication was performed, relation to head of household, and the category of ration card. I'll just explain the last two in more detail. So in my field work, I also found that it was very common to transfer children's names to their grandparents' ration cards to enable them to authenticate on behalf of their elderly grandparents whose fingers were either failing or they couldn't physically make it to the PDS shop. And hence I wanted to know what kind of other kinship patterns were being recorded in the data, because generally if you're the ration cards are issued to nuclear families. So if a new family begins, they detach their names from their parents' cards. But here I found that a lot of grandchildren were performing authentication on behalf of their grandparents. And I was also interested in knowing the category of ration cards that have the most children performing authentication, because there are 4 categories in Rajasthan. There is the APL ration card, there is Antyodaya, which is for the poorest households. Then there are the BPL households, which is the below poverty line. And there is another category called the state below poverty line, which has the category of the state BPL is often lower than the one set at the national BPL level. So some of the caveats to the data that I received from the state, there were several data entry errors in the data that I received. So for instance, Aadhaar biometrics are only collected for children from age 5 onwards, but the data that I received had ages right from 1 with even 0 and negative numbers in it. So state officials attributed these anomalies to data entry errors in the PDS database. Also, there is a mismatch between the age of the beneficiary on the ration card and the current age. Therefore, all ages that I received were approximate. It was also difficult to ascertain the total number of children performing authentication. So the figures in the state's data are not representative of the total number of children linked to authentication, but it is the number of times that children are linked to Aadhaar authentication. So what this means is that if the same child is authenticating every month, they would be performing 12 authentications in a year. So because the data consists of the total number of authentications that are logged, there is no way to really uniquely ascertain the number of children performing authentication. Also, the data is of children linked to Aadhaar authentications and not necessarily biometric authentication. So what this means is that an Aadhaar authenticated transaction may not always be a live biometric transaction, because the state had also introduced the option of receiving a one-time password on the phone number that you have linked to Aadhaar. So if your fingerprint fails, then the dealer could request that an OTP be sent to your mobile number. And using that OTP, you can then get your rations. However, a high number of OTP transactions was also viewed very suspiciously by the state, and a lot of dealers were having their licenses suspended because it was felt that using OTP, the dealers are engaging in corruption. However, post the pandemic, the state has stopped taking such a harsh view of OTPs, and now OTPs are a very viable alternative. The only challenge is that beneficiaries don't always have stable mobile phone numbers, which continues to be a challenge. So the analysis of my RTI data, the state gave me the data in the form of an Excel spreadsheet. I worked on these spreadsheets using the filter function in Excel. So I first ordered the data according to age, and I created 68 separate spreadsheets for all of the ages that I was interested in. And I then worked on the Excel sheets again using the filter function in Excel. So I didn't really use any software. I didn't really run any complicated statistical tests. So this is how the numbers look like. So the total number of times children have been linked to Aadhaar authentication in Rajasthan If you just look at the percentage, they hover at 0.5%. It sees a dip in 2018, and then because for the year 2019, I do not have the complete year's data. They only gave it to me until May. So till the time that I have data, it showed 0.56%. However, these figures begin changing when you begin parsing the data into the kind of ration card or the ration card categories that we're holding. So if you look at Antyodaya ration card holders, which is the poorest households in the state, the number of children linked to Aadhaar authentication rises. So the figures, and they rise every year. So in 2016, children from the poorest households in the state numbered 12.45%, rising to 16% in 2017, and in 2018 it was at 18%. Similarly, if you look at the state BPL households, they also show similar figures, 12% in 2016, going up to 18% in 2018, and this keeps increasing every year. But if you look at below poverty, just the national below poverty line, you don't have as many children coming from there. The percentages fall down to 6%, 8%, 9%. And when you look at above poverty line children, it comes to 2%, 1.93, 1.38, 1.47%. And then if you take a look at the top 8 kinship relations of children linked to Aadhaar authenticated transactions, so you find that children most often authenticate for their households, followed by grandsons, granddaughters, and other categories such as wife, brother, sister. I'm a little unsure how to interpret the category of wife, because all of these are below 18. However, in the state that I'm doing fieldwork in, child marriage has not been completely eradicated. So it could well be that kinship relations that are appearing as wife are genuine wives in that sense. And these are not data entry errors, because they're simply too numerous to be data entry errors. When I bring this to the attention of state officials, they often ask me, why is it a big deal? They point out that all children participate in household errands. It was no different for any one of us while we were growing up. So why should this necessarily be a concern? And why should authenticating for the PDS be viewed differently? And there are several responses to this question. So first is the cost of missing school and leisure on children. But also when you begin parsing the data according to the category of ration cards, you can very clearly see that it is children from the poorest families who authenticate more than children from the above poverty line families. So the burden of having to authenticate or use their fingerprints to get food grains for the families is really resting on the shoulders of children who already are marginalized by their poverty in various ways. And this also challenges the faith in biometric infrastructures that sees the body as a very stable entity that you can rely on, and in which, therefore, you can invest the building of these very large-scale digital infrastructures and claim that this is a measure for inclusion and this is actually a step towards strengthening and bettering food security. And also, going back to what are children's contributions in the building of a nation state. So there is a very popular example of the Adarsh Balak, or the ideal boy, that has been much discussed, something that has been very popular also on social media, going viral, taking the form of memes in contemporary Indian discourse. But originally, the Adarsh Balak was really this poster that was released in India post-independence as an example of how good citizenship habits is being built by this middle-class male child who is, cultivating hygiene, paying attention to physical activity, obedience to parents, obedience to authority, does things like going for a morning walk, helping elders, and all of these were supposed to be the ideals that children should have in the building of a new nation state that has newly attained independence. So while this middle class boy is somebody who becomes very visible in the discourse of nation building, what is less visible and what is almost invisible and is not receiving a lot of attention is really the poor rural child who's currently in today's times performing fingerprint authentication to build the biometric state, simply because their bodies are more amenable towards the performance of this kind of process. And they are also somebody who are more compliant to having to miss school and disruptions in their education than children who belong to the middle class and who are counted as people who figure in the above poverty line of the state. So my current work is really in bringing forth this invisibility of the poor child and the kind of burdens that they are assuming in ensuring that this infrastructure that is ostensibly for to better the inclusion and to strengthen the food security system, but it is because of their bodies and it is because of their willingness to lend their bodies to help their families get food security that the state is also able to fulfill its welfare claims. And with that, I shall conclude my talk by leaving you with this thought, again, drawing from Amartya Sen, who talks about the idea of niti and the nyaya of infrastructure. So Sen talks about niti representing the formal organizational arrangements that form part of the infrastructure, but he urges attention to the nyaya, which takes a more broader and inclusive view of what is this really doing justice. So assess the nature and characteristics of justice and fairness that are emerging from the institutional base that makes up the niti, rather than only focusing on the niti. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions if you have any. These are the references that have contributed to this talk.